Each week on Chatter That Matters, I share a story of someone who overcomes circumstances. And in doing so, they get to chase their dreams and change their world and ours for the better. But once a year, in honor of Canada's birthday, I break format. Instead of focusing on an individual, I look at Canada and what our country needs to do to dream and to set up future generations to have the same opportunities we did. Today's show features two brilliant Canadians, John Ruffolo and John Stackhouse. And both of these individuals work tirelessly to create the circumstances we need as a country to create growth and success. Before I invite John Ruffolo to join me, I also want to share my thoughts on Canada. Mind over matter is what truly matters. Let's be honest, we have stopped believing in the Canadian dream. And I don't blame you. The math and daily reminders do not lie. Our economy, our standard of living, and our productivity are in a free fall. If Canada was a product in a grocery store, it might be stamped outdated, and the alarmists would say expired. And I ask, how is that possible for a country with so few people and so much wealth? What if we focused on what really matters? Growing Canada. It's time for Canadians to believe in what we can be if we have the will. And my belief is that Canada can become an economic and cultural superpower. But first, we have to shed our inferiority complex. We have to believe in our ability to do much bigger things. Next, we must stop boring and burring our way to fiscal collapse. And finally, as voters, we must replace our love for handouts with a passion for dreaming and doing. Every level of government and academia needs to support the dreams of the mass majority. I want a country where crime doesn't pay, hard work is rewarded, entrepreneurship is celebrated, and academia is for preparing our students to thrive, and our tax dollars are revered, and we see accountability, efficiency, and transparency are the only guarantees for a public service job. Canada needs to unlock our trillions of dollars of natural resources, our farmable land. We need to show the world that Canadians and the Indigenous peoples can harness this opportunity in the most ethical and environmental sound manner possible. And these taxes that we garner will fuel our new economy and fund our dream of being a superpower in made-in-Canada green technology. It's also going to strengthen our social net and pay down our debt. We also have to realize that much of the future economy is business without borders. It operates in the cloud with fewer restrictions and freer enterprise. The creative entrepreneurs who drive the future are nomadic and will choose to locate where the best conditions for their ideas to flourish and the best place for their talent and themselves to live and raise a family. So why not Canada? We have all the ingredients to create the best living place. We're democratic, we have energy, water, diversity, culture, and abundant nature. We just need the growth conditions for entrepreneurial ideas to come alive and thrive. Instead of wet cement poured in the feet of dreamers and doers, we must jackhammer away bureaucracy, restrictions, and political narrative in favor of an environment that champions our economic drivers. They are the heroes. We must give our growth engines the fuel they need, supercomputers to model their ideas, capital to fund their growth, and a favorable taxation system that understands risk and reward. We must give them first mover advantage while mitigating their first mover risk. We also have to keep homegrown talent and identify and target equally strong talent worldwide and fast-track their citizenship. Canada, it's time to rekindle our dream and, more importantly, our collective will. Let's shift our mindset to positivity and possibility and chase purpose and pursuit. I hope you find time within your busy schedule to stick around for the entire show. And whether you live in Canada or any country around the world, this message of hope, prioritization, and unification applies to you.
The land of opportunity.
The greatest country in the world.
I guess the opportunity to engage with just a multitude of cultures.
And the opportunity that we have for bilingualism.
First thing that comes to mind is hockey.
The freedom that we have to live here and do what we would like to do.
How beautiful the country is.
Universal health care, I think that's one thing that defines Canada and Canadians.
There's nice people here.
Well, everyone says thank you all the time.
God keeps our land glorious and free.
Freedom, democracy.
It's a great country. Why wouldn't you want to live here?
This is Chatter That Matters with Tony Chapman, presented by RBC.
My first guest is John Ruffolo. He's both a friend and someone I admire for his acumen and how our economy works, and the delicate dance between private enterprise and the role government can and must play. John pulls no punches, nor does he believe in the luxury of time. Canada must go after the future. Canada must make things happen versus watch and wonder what happened. John Ruffolo, welcome to Chatter That Matters. So, John, before we get into the show and talking about productivity and what matters most to Canada, I have to ask you, because the last time you were on the show, and I think it was almost 4 years ago where I interviewed you, you had just come through a horrific accident. And a lot of people said much of what we take for granted is gone, but everything I've seen of you for the last 4 years is your way of saying, I'm not a victim. I'm not disabled. Yes, I've got circumstances to overcome, but you're lifting the spirits of a lot of people, not just in Canada, around the world, that says attitude and approach matters.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Tony. And again, I'm not trying to preach or to virtue signal, but I actually really do not feel or identify myself as a disabled individual, even though I know that I am, and I'm not one of those guys that, will use different words. I'm a disabled individual, but it doesn't stop me from doing the things that I need to do. I still on a daily basis do physio. I do about 18 to 20 hours of physio after about 4 years. It's a part of my life right now. I'm not going to stop until I start walking independently. I do walk on treadmills, with walkers, with poles, but I do have an aided device. I do cycle with my feet, not as fast as I used to. I'll be at about 2,500 kilometers of cycling this year. So I try to do the things that I know I can do, and I tend to not fret about the things that I can't do.
I always said to my daughters, if I could find that switch and just turn it on. When people are in the zone, they have that attitude that they are parting water. I mean, they are doing things that people think are impossible and they're making it possible. Is that also maybe the core idea that we got to talk about today in the show, that Canada and Canadians have to start feeling that way versus being pushed on their back feet? I cited Carolyn Rogers, the World Economic Forum, basically pronouncing us dead, like as a country. How do we find a way to have Canadians start saying, there's so much that's possible that we can be creating as a country if we just believe in each other?
Let's talk about the great things in Canada. We are blessed. We are a country that's blessed with natural resources, a welcoming population as it relates to immigration, good people. We have a good standard of living. These are all the great positives. But we're also a nation that relies on victimhood, and more so in the last dozen years or so. And this is where we start running into a problem. We are believing that the folks who do have the grit, who do want to make the difference, are disincentivized, or in some cases, and you saw this from a recent Canadian federal budget, demonized for their success tenacity. And it's an obligation owing to them that while we're a generous nation with progressive systems, progressive taxation, it's not enough. And again, there's victims out there that it's not their fault. And all of a sudden, we need to feel guilty about it. And the thing that I really believe, and it's kind of how I think about it with my disability, what this country really owes you is the equality of the opportunity. This is what I believe in, but not the equality of the result, because that takes grit and effort. And if you're choosing not to do that, no one owes you the equality of the outcome.
I always talk about entrepreneurs. You've invested in entrepreneurs. I've been an entrepreneur all my life, and they don't mind getting on a high wire act between the sense of risk to reward. They feel that they're surrounded with the right people. They've thought it through. They're not, they're very careful, but they're not afraid to get on it. But it seems like as a country, we're pouring wet cement on that high wire in terms of bureaucracy, taxation, to the point where nowadays I don't necessarily need to be in Canada to be on that wire. If we lose that energy and those beacons of people that have blazed the trails, what do we have left?
Entrepreneurs are odd creatures. Some of the greatest entrepreneurs are extremely odd. Money doesn't drive most of them. Solving something big in particular is what motivates them. Doing something that changes the world. And this is why, again, I'm going to devolve back to this federal budget. It wasn't about the tax. It was the narrative. And the narrative of taxing success and demonizing the success. And in essence, popularizing the notion that we're all better off if we're employees, and perhaps employees of the state, as opposed to even employees of private enterprise. And the problem with that narrative is the people who you're directing it to are actually the most mobile of people. And frankly, let's go back to point number one. Their focus is not maximization of their wealth. Their focus is, can I solve this big problem? And if I can't solve it in Canada, I am obligated to solve it anywhere in the world that allows me the greatest advantage in winning. And that's the mindset that we need to think about in Canada. At a bare minimum, do not get in the way of these folks. Ideally, get out of the way and support him in some of the areas that could actually help them compete on a global basis.
It seems so obvious, yet when I look at what our leaders are excited about is cutting a ribbon at a branch plant or, investing in something big. And as opposed to going, there's such strength in numbers. If we unleash this entrepreneurial class and we're solving these problems, they're not just problems we're solving for Canada. These are problems and solutions we can be exporting around the world.
Yes. I mean, it's kind of funny, from a public policy perspective. So when you look at, so Canada has great people and natural resources. Let's just use two examples. One of the things that we are lacking is the deep capital pools that perhaps the United States has. And so we need to invite foreign direct investment to coming in, and in particular as a source of capital. This has been a big weapon in the innovation industry. You need a strong domestic source of capital, but you need to supplement it, particularly when you need large capital. So inviting that in is definitely great for our economy. What's bizarre, though, so here we are capital constrained. And then what are we focusing instead? We're focusing in on inviting foreign-based multinationals, giving them billions of dollars as opposed to trying to help create the local winners. Now, there might be some narrow cases where it's required, particularly if there's opportunities for technology transfer. But what we're really doing is subsidizing with massive taxpayer dollars jobs that, frankly, I think we can do on a far more effective basis. So I agree with you. But I'll tell you, it's the easiest thing for a lot of politicians to do is to cut a check that's not their money, it's the taxpayer money, cut a ribbon and say, look at us, as opposed to solving some of the underlying fundamental issues.
I want to pull us back a bit because one of my theses is that we can't have voter literacy without having financial literacy. And one of the words that's being talked about a lot is productivity. And I'd love for you to explain to listeners, what is productivity and why does it matter? Why is it, in fact, the lifeblood of our standard of living?
When I describe productivity to folks, I separate the notion of productivity from innovation. They're not the same thing, but they're related. So productivity, and it's frankly a more of an old economy computation that's becoming less and less relevant, frankly, with the digital economy, but it's the best that we have right now. It is the value of goods or services produced per unit hour labor worked. So you have two choices to increase your productivity. You either produce or provide higher valued goods or services, which is really the great value or the great driver in the long run, but it's harder to do. Or you cut the human input costs, which is a little easier to do. Well, how do you do that on the denominator? Well, you replace human labor with machine labor. And machine labor is really coming from the innovation industry, whether it's robotics, artificial intelligence. And the problem that Canada has is both a numerator and a denominator. Let me start off with the easier one being the denominator. Many of our companies in the variety of industries are not utilizing or producing that product in the most efficient manner possible. And it's important, particularly when you're competing on a global basis, because if you don't have the best product or the most effective pricing, you're just not going to sell your product. One of the issues that we do have in Canada is that we do have a lot of regulatory protected industries, in which case they're not actually competing globally, but they're enjoying the protections of that regulatory environment in Canada and are not being as productive as perhaps they should be. And when you look to see Canada, and let's just use the United States, the robotics that are used in manufacturing processes in the United States outweigh Canada tremendously. And when I see the Canadian firms that do the same thing, I was just speaking to the founder, CEO of Linamar, and that was their key to success in leveraging robotics in their manufacturing processes. Where it gets a little bit harder, but it's absolutely essential, is how do you produce higher valued goods? Let me give you a very easy example in the natural resource industry. We extract oil from the ground, but we don't refine it here. Or if it's LNG, we don't refine it here. So we send off the raw materials. We have somebody else process it. And most astonishingly, we're actually buying a bunch of it back as a finished product and paying an exorbitant price. Well, if you keep the value chain here and capture the profits throughout the value chain, the productivity would also increase. So those are kind of the two levers.
I want to break it down for the listener. So what I'm hearing is we could measure productivity. The average person could cut 10 logs in an hour. You give them a chainsaw, it goes up to 15 logs. You put it on a more advanced machine, it goes to 20 logs, and you can get so far with that. But if we really want to think big, is we shouldn't be thinking about harvesting our tree and even cutting it a log. We should be thinking, what can we do with that wood to turn it into a finished product and enjoy the margin that comes from that innovation?
Correct.
So that's a core component of Canada, that, we're still that hewers of wood and pumpers of oil versus it. You've come out and really talked about the move we got to make on the chessboard is one where we're going to drive this innovation economy. We've got so many resources, intellectual, emotional, natural resources, diverse population. We just have to have a mindset. But you talk about Team Canada in some of your articles. Talk to me about Team Canada and why this must be a collective and conscious act upon all of us versus just maybe isolated to even some people like you that are just very focused on innovation.
And I'll use the innovation industry. So this is, more of the classically technology industry. So why is that important? For two reasons. Number one, if we build the innovations and sell them to the rest of the economy, it makes the rest of the economy more productive. But with a vibrant innovation economy, the value of the goods or services produced can be extraordinarily high because you look at, say, a company like Google, they're producing all of their profits based on intangible or intellectual property. You don't need as many workers to do this because there's not physical supply chains building these products. So innovation is a huge driver of productivity. Now, so speaking on the innovation community, when I talk about a team Canada approach. I use the analogy of a farmer. Think of the farmer as the entrepreneur. And it's up to the farmer to find the plot of land, to hire the farm hands to pick the seeds, to determine which seeds will generate the greatest amount of value. And then the farmer relies upon the government to perhaps make fertilizer more cheaply available, might develop the land so that it is available for farming. It might provide irrigation systems so that the farmers could actually tap into. So it's those infrastructure-like things. It might also pull away things that get in the way. So maybe there's an infestation of invasive species, or there's certain weeds that a government could kind of come in and take those away to maximize the success for those entrepreneurs. And the third part of the wheel are things that make the plants or food grow bigger, faster, stronger, better. So these are the sources of capital. This is venture capitalists, accountants, lawyers, the ecosystem around it. All three need to be brought together to ensure the success of that farmer. And what happens, the entire community benefits from that success.
And why doesn't that happen? Every time I listen to you, whether you're talking or when I read one of your articles or watch one of your videos, you really make such common sense. But it seems like more often than not, when it comes to Team Canada, there's a lot of uncommon sense.
To be blunt, politics seems to be getting in the way. Canadians used to be pretty smug about the vast majority of Canadians for many, many years, for as long as I've been in my working life, have been governed and followed in the center. Whether you were slightly left of center or slightly right of center, it never mattered, because this is what Canada really is. And the United States, we witnessed the United States really over the last 2 to 3 decades start to polarize and start to move away from the center, and folks starting to grab either the left end or the right end. And we were kind of smug here, kind of astonished what was happening in the United States. And it's crossed the border. And what's happening is that when you start getting that polarization, you start pitting groups against one another. And, the United States has its challenges in how they're pitting groups against one another. But in Canada, for some bizarre reason, we pit people against one another, economically speaking. And, we're starting to see a lot of words around class warfare and zero-sum gain. And when you start dealing in a zero-sum gain and somebody is responsible for your perceived lack of financial success, this is when we start getting into the problem. So using my analogy, all of a sudden, people may not want to see that farmer so successful. And why is that farmer successful? And I don't think that's very, very fair. And this is where Canada is starting to get into trouble. And what we need to really stop, I believe that the first group that starts to come again together into the center and starting to work together, I think that will focus in on what the real prize is. It's not us against each other, but it is Canada versus the rest of the world. And the only way that we're going to win, just like Team Canada in hockey, is getting our best coming together and competing against the rest of the world and not within each other.
So you talk about, how Canada, and I agree with you, Paul Martin, Jean Chrétien, Stephen Harper, Brian Mulroney, they really weren't that far apart, and much of our consensus happened in the middle ground. Do you think it's politicians, or do you think social media also has to be accountable for how effortlessly, they seem to herd us into these castles where we're surrounded by like-minded people liking like-minded content, validating each other and realizing, well, this is all that's right. Then those people across the valley must be wrong.
Yeah, I don't think it's actually politicians at all. The politicians are a reflection of what's already becoming polarized. And then the politicians are responding to that polarization. It is interesting. It's kind of hard to put your finger on it, but when social media started to truly cross the chasm, it was about 2008. And I don't know if you remember, Tony, in 2008, when we were talking about the social graph and all of this great stuff that was going to happen. One thing I have learned over 30 years of being in technology is that every single technology that I've ever invested in is a double-edged sword, everything. And on the social media, we were all looking at the bright side of this. So it's the same thing what's going to happen on generative AI, by the way, unfortunately. And what happens is it was leveraged as an echo chamber following 2008, very slowly and haphazardly. And then all of a sudden, you started listening and engaging with only the folks or only the sources that you really wanted to believe. And seeing the other side was viewed as something bad. And when the discussions from a economic or political perspective are pre-decided, not based on the quality of your thought, but rather which end of the political spectrum you belong, this is when we have a problem. And, the funniest thing is, even I'll use the political parties, we have far more in common than we have differences, but yet we never, ever talk about the similarities and what we have in common, like family, like, frankly, everyone wants a good environment. Everyone wants sustainability, but we deal with all of the small stuff in there or all the hows because we believe in doing it in a different manner. So it is a very complicated issue, but I worry we're spending so much time on those differences that we're forgetting about the farmer.
I want to talk about some of the other things that you've been so vocal in the media lately, which I totally respect. A lot of people with your smarts don't have the courage or conviction to come out the way you are. First of all, impact of the capital gains tax changes. We touched on it a little bit when we were talking about incentive, but you're very against this for the very reason, not so much that entrepreneurs, whether it's about they're there for economic reward, it's just simply telling the world that the conditions for succeeding aren't here.
So that's the problem. And this is the misnomer. And it's very, very hard to talk in sound bites, but it's not the taxation per se. It's the narrative around it. So the full narrative is we've got ourselves into a spending problem in this country. I mean, again, let's just use common sense. Does anyone spend money that they don't have? Or will they be incurring debts that your children or grandchildren are going to have to repay? Of course, you'd say that's absolutely nonsense. But that's what we're doing fundamentally. And then we're figuring out after the fact is how the heck are we going to pay for all of this stuff? And the part that really infuriated me was that, about 4 or 5 months beforehand, it wasn't us who characterized this upcoming budget as the productivity and innovation budget. It was the government that actually said, this is what it's going to be about. And the really sad part is that I was involved in the development of a few of the ideas, the R&D tax credit reform, the artificial intelligence. I was involved peripherally on the open banking, some really great things. And that's the sad thing I was saying. There's some really good stuff in this budget, but then you overlaid it with the capital gains tax. And again, the entrepreneurs, ultimately, they don't give a hoot about paying additional tax. They're going for success, but it's challenging for them at the best of times. They're struggling getting people in. Cost of living for their employees is tougher. Their markets are better in the United States. U.S. government is a better procurer of Canadian innovation than Canadian governments on. I can list like so many, the capital availability goes on and on and on. And they're still here because they love this country. And then the government comes out and in their narrative basically said, you know what? You are benefiting too much. Yeah, I don't care about the risk that you're taking. I don't care that you're betting it all and could lose it all. And frankly, Tony, you would know as well as anybody, the odds of success are so stacked against you. And they're daring compare this to employees of public services who never take a risk. They're needed and they're valued, but they take no risk. They get, huge pensions. Their jobs are largely guaranteed. And you're basically saying, I don't like the fact that, they might, and I say might have a higher effective tax rate. Well, they don't have a higher effective tax rate. One element of the income of an entrepreneur might be a capital gain once in their lifetime after blood, sweat, and tears and earning nothing. And it was received as a big slap in the face. It was received by the entrepreneurs of, God damn it, I'm killing myself. I could make the move and it's very easy for me to do it, but I am patriotic. But at some point, now that you're shitting on me and you're vilifying me and people are calling me greedy, screw you. I'm just going to go to the United States because frankly, that's probably where the logical answer is. And this is where I was astonished and trying to explain to government saying, folks, do you know what you're doing? You're actually biting the hand that feeds you. But at the end of the day, what we're dealing with is a political issue of solving a massive spending, frankly, to attract votes. The polls are not, lying here. The prevailing government is so far behind the opposition that they're doing desperate measures, but it's bearing them further into the ground. And that is why there has been a massive opposition to this, not only from the innovation sector, but from all of the small business owners, doctors, dentists, cottage owners who realize, oh my God, you're coming after me too. And it's that little adage of, you better speak up because you know what? You just might be next.
Well, that's one area that I think is just a massive psychological blow. And I think your point is this is the narrative is even more powerful than the actual number. And I think that's profound. I also want to talk to you about talent and immigration, because to me, I never thought of immigration as a quota, as a number. I always thought it was a strategic advantage for Canada. People would cut off their arm to come and live in this country. And with that scarcity and that opportunity, we had the ability to attract the best and the brightest. But it seems to me now that it's not about the strength and talent, but it's about this number that I just can't believe that we can be vetting all of these people and saying that they make sense for what we need to do as a country going forward.
Canada has great talent. I put it up against anyone in the world, no question. The issue is building a lot of these companies, particular innovation, just requires a lot of talent. And we're not just producing enough of the talented folks, whereas other countries, particularly India, China, et cetera, are. And we need those folks in order to compete globally. So, we need to be welcoming these folks in. Now, Canada also has a birth rate that's well below the 2.1 children per person. We're down to, I can't remember if it's 1.3 or 1.5, so extremely low. And so we need a replenishment factor, or else we're not going to have people to help support all of the social programs that we value in this country. What the change has been, though, and Canada was actually relatively consistent for a few decades, that we were sort of averaging around 300-ish thousand immigrants. I think the peak immigration in the last almost 100 years was in the mid 1950s, where it peaked at around 400,000 people, but we had a much smaller population. But so we've averaged in this 300, 350 for a number of years. It still was above the rate of housing. Our housing was a number that was between 200 and 300,000 housing starts. So still didn't quite make it, but it was reasonably close. Our infrastructure was a different story. But what they would do is that they would cap categories of immigrants. And my understanding was that they capped the refugee immigrants at 25,000 out of that 300,000-ish, which, Canada is a great country. We have a social conscience. Let's do that. But the rest were family unification, but mostly economic immigrants, which we need. So basically, these are folks who are coming here to work and to add value, whether you be in the trades, doesn't matter, all good, but basically skilled labor. What's happened running the clock over the last few years is that now we're at 1.2 million, monstrous increase. We are, if I'm not mistaken, the biggest immigrating country in the world. Although I got to double check that with the United States, but if we're not number one, we're in the top two.
Our population size, we're certainly number one.
We're number one relative population by far, and yet we didn't change any of our infrastructure and housing, and we don't even have enough jobs to support that. And frankly, and if we did, we're not even bringing in the same skilled labor. We're bringing in many folks who are then going on social assistance, and we're just compounding the actual problem. So we went from a great advantage of immigration, and I would call it, it was never perfect, of course, but I'd call it smart immigration, to irresponsible immigration. And now what's going to happen is that we're going to have to massively cut that right back and to fix our problems. And that has to happen. And again, we took this wonderful advantage into now something that's now a political hot potato. And a lot of folks are now vilifying immigration when, in fact, we still need it, but not the way it's being done right now.
How many jobs will be lost because of AI and how many jobs will be created because of AI. And that has to factor in terms of our immigration, or we're just going to be, as you said, bringing in a lot of people that are going to be relying on social assistance when they really want to be chasing the Canadian dream.
Yeah, this is a complicated analysis. And again, lots of different views. So I'll give you my view. We have definitively shortages in certain areas of the economy. So the trades, my friends who are home builders can't find anybody at all. And you've got a lot of talented folks around the world who would do anything to become, plumbers, electricians, bricklayers, you name it. So folks like that, welcome them in, because we really need to move the needle. Now, when it relates to, say, innovation jobs and AI, let's go back to what I said at the very beginning. Productivity is, on the denominator front, is about the replacement of human labor with machine labor. In the short term, you will need fewer folks. And the difference on AI is it tends to be white collar folks, not the blue collar folks. The blue collar folks went through their changes over the last few decades before that. I do believe it's a temporary friction. I don't know how long it's going to last, but what is likely going to happen is there are going to be a number of folks who were in white collar who will find themselves that if they don't retrain, they may be displaced and finding jobs that are below their skill sets. And that will create frustration, and that will require social assistance to help support them through the transition. But like every other introduction of technology. This has happened since the Industrial Revolution, that the replacements happen, and then people figure out different jobs that they never imagined before. The difference this time, though, versus the last 150 years, the rate of change of displacement is the fastest it's ever been. And we as humans cannot move that fast in society. And so, yes, will there be a temporary friction in society? For sure. Hopefully it's not permanent, but that is the social challenge with the introduction of AI.
So if you even took a conservative estimate of the jobs that would be lost, is it fair to say that even though we're not creating the birth rate to sustain our population, it is possible to say that Canada could be run very efficiently at 15 million or 20 million people or 25 million. It doesn't necessarily mean that the numbers we've always put forward, because we're going to be going into an era where less people and potentially more productivity.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a live experiment going on in the world today called Japan. Japan's had, I guess, about 3 decades of stagnant productivity, but it hasn't imploded as fast as we thought, because if you go to Japan, the amount of replacement from a robotics perspective is astounding. Just walk in the streets of Tokyo, you'll see vending machines absolutely everywhere, where they used to be humans that would be, if you wanted a drink or snacks, etc., or convenience stores. And so you're absolutely right. It's a big question whether do you need, aside from the trades and building stuff, which I'm not, right now, AI is not going to physically replace that, at least not today anyways, but maybe in the future. But maybe we don't need the same level of replacement. But I would say to you, once you do get below the 2.1, there is a hole there, but it feels like we're filling in a gap that's getting us beyond the 2.1 needed to sustain a society.
You've talked about Canada enjoys these great free trade agreements with countries all over the world, but when we look inside, we've got massive walls and barriers preventing us from doing business with each other. How does that change?
Go back to the common sense. Let's use energy policy for a moment. And here's Germany. After Fukushima hit, the anti-nuke lobby in Germany convinced the government to decommission all of their nuclear power. And the very last one was being decommissioned as the Russians moved into the Ukraine. And there was this moment of, holy shit, what did we just do? And I don't think that timing was very coincidental. And now without the nuclear power, the Germans were reliant upon the Russian natural gas, and we're supporting the Ukrainians and the Germans. Ask us, can we ship them LNG? And we have so much capacity of LNG, and we basically gave them the proverbial finger, and Germany had to turn around and go to the Qataris, a country where, we have some serious concerns with, number one. But number two, if we said no, the only energy supply right now that will give Germany enough baseload power is coal, because they do have solar and they do have wind, but it doesn't give them baseload. So can you imagine then, here we are with our high horse of sustainability, encouraging, in essence, countries to burn coal, which is the worst of all possibilities. And I know that LNG is a carbon-based fuel, but there are no absolutes in life. And guess what we get to do? We also get to help folks out west, and Canada makes a great amount of money on that so that we could invest in more renewable energy, et cetera. So we get caught in the way of politics. And that's what drives me nuts. We view Canada as Team Canada first, and how do we most effectively compete against the rest of the world, I think that would help us go a long way.
That's something Canada can turn into a competitive advantage globally, because a lot of investors looking for those long-term opportunities. I've sat around tables. It's been a beautiful sight to see how they see that in Indigenous leaders. And there's an opportunity there that Canadians have to lean into this and turn it into that national collective advantage.
Those are the words of John Stackhouse, who works tirelessly campaigning as both a citizen in Canada and a senior executive at RBC to encourage positive change. He believes that we can have it all: growth and prosperity, care for each other, while also caring for Mother Nature. When we return, I pose one of the biggest questions I've ever asked on Chatter That Matters, one that involves all of us. And John's answer? Well, it might surprise you. Hi, it's Tony Chapman. Investing in Canada? Well, that matters to RBC. $500 billion in sustainable financing to combat climate change. $500 million for Future Launch, a 10-year program to prepare youth for the jobs of tomorrow. Helping to discover the next generation of Olympians, artists monetizing their talents, women entrepreneurs pursuing their dreams, supporting mental health, and so much more. Investing in Canada, well, that matters to RBC.
Oh, Canada, our home and native land.
How beautiful the country is.
Universal health care, I think that's one thing that defines Canada and Canadians.
People are wonderful here.
Everything seems to be pretty nice.
You can walk a couple blocks and there's something different.
Everything.
Maple syrup.
Maple syrup.
The weather.
It's amazing, and I love Canada in the summertime. It's awesome.
It's just so clean, free, open, and everyone just is so friendly.
All the different arts and community, culture, outdoor life as well.
I'm free to be me.
Hockey's pretty.
People. Happy Canada Day.
You're listening to Chatter That Matters with Tony Chapman, presented by RBC.
My guest today is John Ruffolo. His mind fires with brilliance, his heart roars with passion, and his ideas are pragmatic and actionable. You talk about government procurement support and how there's a lot of countries that say small business is the lifeblood of our economy. We take advantage of the size of the government spending and give them their fair shot. But that's not really happening in Canada the way it should be.
Not at all. It's atrocious. So if I were to pick the number one bone to pick by innovators, it's the procurement policies of all three levels of government. The innovators are not asking for a handout at all. What they're really saying, all else being equal, buy Canadian. And we act like a bunch of Boy Scouts in Canada. Oh, well, we can't do that because someone's going to complain at the, on the World Trade Organizations or what have you. And I keep on saying, have any of you guys ever heard of this thing called Buy America? Or have you heard of the Inflation Reduction Act? And every country in the world has their domestic policies. And yet Canada is so afraid to be proudly supporting that. Now, when you look at procurement, two very noticeable observations. The risk aversion by folks that are procuring is astounding. And in particular, if there is a competitive bid and there is a well-known international name, particularly a US-based name, versus a Canadian domestic, almost every time the foreign international wins the bid for a few reasons. People love to have selfies with some of these big companies because it's sexier. The companies have far greater lobbyists on staff, marketing budgets, wining and dining budgets, all of this sort of stuff. But even if all of that was solved, they are, and I see this so many times, far more deceptive in the way that they win their procurement. So what they do is the biggest brownie points goes to cost. And frankly, it's almost always cost because they can't assess the value differential. So they just simply say, okay, who's got the lowest cost? Well, if you have a big multi-billion-dollar organization, let's go and let's go with them. And it looks like it's the lowest price. But what they don't understand is that there is differences in scope. And then what ends up happening is there is a variety of scope changes. And then over the course of time, they actually end up spending a lot more than they've ever imagined. You want a real live example? We're going through one right now, which is under criminal investigation, is the whole ArriveCan app. When you see what that original procurement, I can't remember if it was 800,000 or it was some small number, and it ended up being $54 million with all of these additions, changes, and blah, blah, blah. Like the number of Canadian companies that said with what they actually delivered, like I could produce that at a fraction of that dollar, but yet our Canadian companies, frankly, maybe it's wrong. They go on there on an ethical basis saying, well, you've said this is what you want and this is what it's going to cost. And maybe it's the lack of sophistication of our folks who, don't realize maybe there's an opportunity for them to cheat the government. But, it drives me nuts. This is the single easiest way where you basically say every department, all else has to be equal. So this would add tens of billions of dollars of revenues to the Canadian companies. The greatest value you can drive to any business is to deliver them revenue, and particularly if it's recurring revenue. And yet we can't do this very basic ask.
Before we wrap it up, you touched upon, being a superpower and LNG to our allies. Isn't that same argument? We could be the most ethically sourced food. We could be involved, like some of the places we could be a superpower in. I mean, we were a superpower in AI. Can we hold on to that? I think of Nortel years ago with our switching technology, and basically those patents ended up in China. Our lithium mines are getting sold. I mean, is there a way we can have this North Star as a country that says in these 3 or 4 areas, we are going to be a superpower to the world, at least to the allies that value the moral compass of Canada? All things being equal, they'd rather buy from us than anywhere else in the world. Why can't we bring that forward as a strategy for our new economy?
Tony, you're absolutely bang on. I always worry that we don't devolve back to our past of being, the drawers of water, hewers of wood.
Yeah.
But we should not be ignoring our strategic advantage. So let's talk about sustainability and EV. What did we focus in on? We focused in on paying billions of dollars to have foreign-based multinationals to set up battery assembly plants. Yet the raw materials, whether it's lithium, cadmium, graphite, nickel, you name it, is being imported by other countries. And why isn't it that we're not linking that to a Canadian supply chain, doing it in a sustainable way? I mean, in the past, we did these things horribly and created environmental damage. Well, we figured that out mostly, and use that advantage. And exactly what you said, one thing about Canada, which, as a proud Canadian, we used to have this moral authority in the world. And we did lose it. But it's not gone forever again. And if we want to be the champions of, say, sustainability and renewable energy, and boy, very few countries know energy like Canada. Let's take advantage of the great resources we have, encourage the transition to the world, mine the materials that are needed, and we have the expertise. And how do we get it to be bigger, faster, cheaper, more sustainable with all the great innovations that we have? It's all a nice, virtuous circle. but we need to get started on it. And, the last thing I would just say is, it was part of the question you asked me earlier. Canada is going to be in serious trouble where if the focus of our nation is how do we carve up our pie by making each one of us fight over remaining crumbs of that pie, as opposed to how do we just make this pie bigger for absolutely everyone to participate and enjoy? That's the mindset. That's the mentality that we need. And it takes strong leadership to get everyone thinking along those same lines.
You think democracy as it stands today can bring us to that?
I fundamentally believe in democracy, but I also fundamentally believe in capitalism. I believe in smaller government, not from an ideological perspective whatsoever. I just believe that the private sector is the most efficient allocator of scarce resources through pricing mechanisms. And until something else shows me it's more productive in the long run, I'm still waiting to hear that. So based on those two, I think that we don't really have a choice, number one. And number two, I think it's very possible. I do think, though, where we're on this treadmill is whenever I go back to the polarization issue, and you could see it very clearly, and the US was even a little bit of a better example. Once you start to pull away from the center, then you get an equal and opposite reaction from the other side of the political spectrum that pulls it not even equally, but just a little bit more. And then you get the opposite. And then you start to realize, oh my God, we're really far apart on the political spectrum now. How did this happen? Well, what it really is going to take, and I would say specifically in Canada, and I'm going to say that 80% of Canadians like to be governed in the center. And everyone who I speak to, and it doesn't matter on their what their station in life or what they do, again, they're kind of in that center. I think we just got to stop keeping on yanking to moving further to your political spectrum and move back into, as close as possible to the center. And again, doesn't matter if you're left or right. It's all the same thing. I think that's the path forward. And hopefully the first person to offer the olive branch of saying, you know what I love to see? I love to see this in question period. Somebody get up and say to the government, you know what? That was a really good idea. Well done. And sit right back down. Yeah. Wouldn't that be, it would be like, I think we'd be shocked and wondering what the heck is going on. And of course, you will always get the 20%, on extremists on the other side. And who cares? Because the 80% in the middle is what we should be focused in on. But I would love a little bit more of actually governing and doing things to create value and not so much politics. But that's why I would make a very bad politician, I guess.
It's funny because I hear you and John Love and some of the people that are very accomplished CEOs. They know how to prioritize resources. As you said, private enterprise is the best in terms of scarce resources. So to me, it's not so much democracy that I want to take away the right of the people to vote. I want to have democracy come back where it's for the people and not the party. It's probably the best way I could say it. And I just look at the size of our government, the fact that accountability is a key word that you said. I mean, that we don't treat our tax and borrowed dollars as precious. We consider them almost this magical printing press. So I want to leave with you sort of just saying, if you were prime minister, I know you're working on some public policy themes, and I know that there's some big thinking that you're investing in right now. Is there anything you can kind of leave the audience with saying, if I was prime minister, or if there's a prime minister that would get my full support, what would they be doing over the course of the next 12 to 24 months to just at least show Canadians that there's a sense of attitude, the switch is going on?
I would say there's two key components without getting to the very specifics of the categories of whether it's economic policy or what have you. Number one, can we have a plan? There is no strategic plan for Canada. What's the first thing that a CEO does when they get a job in a company leading an organization? They develop the 5-year strategic plan. Where are we going? None of us know where we're going. We're all confused. And even when you look at this latest budget, it looks like it was hastily put together, and we can't define the path so that if we have to go through some pain, I think everyone would be willing to go through some pain if we see what the other side might look like or where you might be going. That's number one. Number two, what I would do, and this is where governments run into a big problem, is that you're not engaging with stakeholders. When you start to think that you know the answers, because I certainly don't, and if I was in there, the first thing that I would do is understand the various constituencies. And at the end of the day, government is there for the people, not for their own self-interest. So they need to really figure out not only what the strategic plan is, but what is it that the people want. And it might be that the people want something that's not attainable. And your job is to get them to understand what is possible and what is not. But that dialogue, and the last thing I would just say is that as part of that dialogue, like, I really would love to see non-partisanship. I was on the board of an environmental organization, and we were looking at our board makeup and trying to figure out what characteristic of a board member that we needed. And I said that we need to find the most influential person that really dislikes our organization and is opposed ideologically to that organization, and could we convince that person to be on the board, because we need to listen to the objectives and to try to identify where are the points that we would agree. It would be the healthiest thing, but we tend to be afraid. We try to seek affirmation with the same people who you already know in advance are going to agree with you. So again, it creates this echo chamber. So, again, Tony, when you ask, why have I been so vocal? I believe in democracy. I also believe that you need to speak up, and you speak up not out of your own self-interest, but what you honestly believe is for the good of Canada, and give your reasons why. You might disagree with it. The more we do that in this country and actually engage in discussion, I think will be the pathway for us to hopefully get over some of these huge impediments.
So, John, I always end my shows with my 3 takeaways. And one, I am such a fan of yours because I am so aligned with how much you love Canada, because I love this country. And I see nothing but possibility and positivity if we have that North Star. And one of the things you said at the end is that strategic plan that says this is what we're going to bet on. And this is why it's going to matter to us. And more importantly, it's going to matter to your children and future children, because everybody that immigrated to Canada came here for a better life for their children. Nonstop. Every immigrant, every refugee I've had on this show, I left my country, my culture, everything I knew, because I wanted a better life for my children. And that's the first thing I would love to see. What you talk about is that strategic plan that has everybody saying we're all in. I love that. Second thing, I love what you said about entrepreneurs. They're not there for money. They're there to solve big problems. They're there to identify unmet needs and fill those needs. That's what they play with. And as you said, they're often odd, they're different, they're unique. Sometimes they're on the spectrum, but they're extraordinary minds. And in that positive energy they create comes jobs and innovation and export. And we have to do everything we can to make Canada a magnetic place for them versus turn the magnet around and we're repelling them. So I totally buy into it. And the last thing that we really was a cornerstone of this conversation is how, as a country, we need to move back to the center and find common ground and consensus. And left versus right really is just tiny shades of the fact that this is about Canada, what we stand for, what we're building as a country together, and having that sense of mutual respect versus what I find question period now is just getting snackable content from my little social media sound bites and a level of smugness of he said and no you said. I think all of that coming together, North Star for this country, celebrate our entrepreneurship and invest in them, support them, revere them. Isidore Sharps and the Kofflers and Aldo Shoes and the Lululemons, all these incredible entrepreneurs that have come out of Canada, punched above our waist class and find the center. I think if we could do those three and maybe convince you to run for Prime Minister, today would be a good day's work.
Well summarized.
Joining me now is John Stackhouse, who's been on my show several occasions, and why he has context. He's a former editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, Canada's national newspaper. Today he sits in the office of the president of RBC as their senior VP. He heads up many strategic portfolios, including really trying to get a handle on the future. John, welcome back to Chatter That Matters.
Hey, Tony. Great to be with you.
My first question is, there has to be three of you. As I follow you on LinkedIn, you are everywhere. And I'm not just talking about across Canada, but around the world. And really not only participating as sort of an attendee, but very often shaping the content on the stage. So my first question is, how do you find time to do all of that?
I think three of me is a very scary thought, but thank you for that observation, Tony. I mean, 90% of it is a great team. I get to work with wonderful people here at RBC. I think focus is really important, just knowing what you're going to execute on every day, every week. There is something also to the 10,000 hours school that the more you do, the more you can do.
I just had Malcolm Gladwell on my show, and one of the things he said is he never, ever imagined that 10,000 hours would have been the thing that exploded out of his career. And everybody comes up to him and says, guess what? I have 10,000 hours. He goes, that wasn't the point. So you talk about focus. What are you focusing on? Because I think, the way I characterized you is you are deeply committed and passionate about Canada and the country we can become.
If it's one word, Tony, it's competitiveness. We need to be more competitive as a country, more competitive as an economy. We're pretty good, but not a lot of prizes for in a third or fourth place on the world stage. We've been doing a lot of research at RBC through our economics team on productivity, as have others, and it's alarming. It's really alarming. We are poorer per capita when you factor out inflation than we were a decade ago. We have fallen behind the likes of Australia over the last 25 years. Similar country, similar economy, similar people in many ways, but they've really upped their game where we have not. We've fallen well behind the United States. And this means if you're in Ontario and looking at someone doing the same thing in California, they're producing 20, 30% more doing the same thing. And therefore, they're going to be paid more, whether they're self-employed as an entrepreneur or as an employee. That's just the math of economics. So how do we take a bit of a breath as a country and focus on that productivity challenge?
Is this a mindset issue? Because I would argue that some countries just seem to have a swagger that says we belong as number one. This is our destiny. We're here to make things happen, versus Canadians at times be more about watch and then respond to what happens? Yeah,
that's part of it, Tony. And I think that goes right down to our education system. It goes down to how we approach a number of challenges. And look, we are the envy of the world in terms of our inclusiveness, in terms of our taking care of others. And that's an incredible strength that we should not allow to erode. This is a great country to live and work in and to start a business in and to grow a business in. It's just got room for improvement. And part of that is the attitude.
And why RBC taking this on? And I'm always been fascinated with organizations that maybe move beyond their core business and say that we have a higher purpose than just answering our shareholders. This is more about sharing values with the country.
Well, I'd say, Tony, it is our core purpose to help clients thrive and communities prosper. And that communities prospering is about society prospering. And Canada, particularly our home market, needs to prosper more. Prosperity is not just economic growth, but it's hard to have all forms of prosperity without economic growth. We cannot afford another decade or so like we've just had. We can't go through the 2030s like we just have and expect to have the same social programs, the same infrastructure, even the same economic fabric of the country if we don't focus on these underlying challenges. I've been incredibly fortunate to be at RBC for close to 10 years now and do get to travel the country, get to talk to business owners, get to talk to community members and leaders in big centers and very small centers as well. And love this country, love the ambition that you see pretty much in every region, and think we have a great opportunity ahead of us in the decade ahead to really turn it up.
I've often said that much of our success can be realized if individuals improve their financial literacy. Therefore, they will improve their voter literacy, because I find Canadians often cast their ballot for the free prize inside, or what's in it for me today, where I think a lot of what you're asking for is to have voters realize that we should be thinking about what's in it for Canada tomorrow. Is that fair?
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to the basics of economics, which have been, these are truisms. We cannot spend more than we save over a period of time. We are doing that as a society. Our governments, plural, are doing that far too much. Individuals are doing that too much. So yeah, financial literacy, including for governments, is pretty important. So we need to save more as a people, and we need to invest that saving in entrepreneurs and people building companies. We have to allow for more of that in the private markets. Governments have to pull back a little bit, not radically, but a little bit, to create more space for that private saving and for the entrepreneurs who turn savings into economic growth.
Spending a lot of time understanding our Indigenous peoples. I would argue unification, reconciliation is about us working much better together. Where are you seeing the most promise so that we can look at each other and say, above all, we're one human race and this is one beautiful country to build?
Yeah, what a beautiful way of putting it, Tony. I get to spend a fair bit of time with Indigenous communities, again, across the country, and always learn and feel very fortunate for those interactions. The desire and frankly, the growing demand for ownership in enterprises and in resource projects is really impressive. This is no longer about give us the benefits and go ahead and do your project. Now it's about what Indigenous leaders call say and share. So they want to say in a project, but they also require a share of the project. They want to be owners, not bystanders. They want to be owners both to make more money off of their natural capital as well as their financial capital, but they also, as owners, know they can be better stewards of those projects and think longer term, which is an economy we need. That's something Canada can turn into a competitive advantage globally, because a lot of investors looking for those long-term opportunities, wanting to put money into something for 20, 30 years. I've sat around tables and it's been a beautiful sight to see how they see that in Indigenous leaders. And there's an opportunity there that Canadians, many already engaged in it, but many more have to lean into this and turn it into that national collective advantage.
Big fan of yours on LinkedIn, and I love the fact that every month you're almost doing Oprah's picks now, the books you're reading. So what one book, if you could have every Canadian read a book in the hope that it helps move this agenda as a country going forward, what book would you want them to read?
What a great question. I mean, a little known one that I just read was a biography of an amazing late Canadian John Evans, and I compared it to the stunning biography of Elon Musk by Walter Isaacson, because it makes a really nice couplet for innovation. sort of that bold American take chances and ignore the risks, which Musk does and has created, challenges, but also incredible things, to that more Canadian John Evans approach of doing things collectively, of building teams, of ensuring there's support for something. And I think that's an important difference for Canadians to appreciate, but also to see how do we not only have that collective approach, but maybe a bit more of that drive. The other book I'm reading now, which I think is really wonderful, but very poignant for National Indigenous Peoples Month, is Valley of the Bird Tail, which is a heartbreaking but illuminating and in many ways inspiring story of two communities in rural Manitoba and how they have struggled. This is a non-Indigenous and an Indigenous community, struggled through generations. Kind of a metaphor for Canada. We live side by side. We work together. We go to school together, even when we may not know that. And yet we are often aliens to each other. So
John, my final question, because when I think of the people that I admire for their ability to think, their heart roar, and have pragmatic actions, and you're one of them, I always ask, why aren't you going into the public service?
Well, thank you for the compliment. Look, I feel I'm able to help the country, and as many are, through the work I do now, and there's an extraordinary range of men and women at all levels of government serving. So I applaud what they do, and hope that we have more representation of the country. But deeper point, especially for this conversation, is how to get more business people into public life. I'm always intrigued in the United States to see kind of this natural flow between government and the private sector. And it's not just about elected office. There's tremendous service that people can do in the bureaucracy, in administrative positions. We've seen great Canadians like Michael Sabia go back and forth, and that should be an inspiration as well. So how do we create more of those opportunities for government employees, civil servants to spend meaningful time in the private sector, and vice versa? I think that would be a good challenge for us all to take on.
John, I appreciate you carving out some time in your incredibly busy schedule. I'm a huge fan of your Disruptors podcast. I hope you continue to find time to do that as well, and everything you're doing to campaign for a better Canada. So thank you for joining me this special Canada Day show.
Tony, thank you for your leadership, and always a pleasure.
Chatter That Matters has been a presentation of RBC.
It's Tony Chapman. Thanks for listening. Let's chat soon.